nation or in captivity in Babylon, we're being given the history that pertains from that point in time to the time of the Messiah. That's what Daniel is prophesying about. Everything is pointing to the Messiah. But what we see here in chapter 8 is there are events that are going to be significant to the Jewish nation in the interim period. We often talk about the intertestamental period and how there's this great period of silence, around 400 years of silence in which there were really no prophets active. But yet Daniel is speaking here in this chapter of significant events in that time frame. He is prophesying about them prior to this period of silence we talk about, but he is discussing events that occur in that period. And we'll talk about the significance, why these events are talked. And then next week when we get into chapter 9, we will have gone from an overview to the period between the Testaments to chapter 9 begins to focus on the period of the Fourth Empire, right? So if you look at the time period, you're given an overview twice, and then you're given a period that pertains to the Jewish nation prior to the rise to power of the fourth kingdom of the visions, and then in chapter 9, everything that pertains to the period of the Fourth Empire. So keep that in mind. Now, something else that you wouldn't notice reading our English Bible, but when we come to chapter 8, Daniel goes from being in Aramaic to being in Hebrew again, right? And we talked about in class, like, that's not something we exactly know the answer to, but there's a hint now as to why it goes back to Hebrew. Because from chapter 2 and the response of Nebuchadnezzar's advisor when the Aramaic sections begin, through chapter 7, we're talking about worldwide events and all these empires. When we come to chapter 8, what are we talking about? We're talking about very specific history that pertains to the Hebrews. And the language switches back to Hebrew. In fact, from here, the rest of the book, we're talking about the history and the events that pertain to the Jewish nation and the conclusion of the Jewish nation and the ushering in of the Messianic period. So when we come to chapter 8 and it switches to Hebrew, it makes sense when you understand those events and what's taking place. So when we come to chapter 8 in Daniel, it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king. If you'll recall, the previous version was in the 1st year of Belshazzar. So we're now in the 3rd year. So we're around 553 BC, somewhere around that, depending on whose dating you rely upon. And he has this vision. And I'm just going to read through verse 14 for now. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Uli Canal. That Uli Canal, it's hard to determine how you're supposed to pronounce that, but everywhere I've heard it said Uli. So I'm going to call it Uli. The Uli Canal. And then I raised my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, southward, and no other beast could stand against him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased and made himself great. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a prominent horn between its eyes. And he came up to the ram that had 2 horns, which had been standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come up beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and smashed his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him, so he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat made himself exceedingly great. But once he became powerful, the large horn was broken, and in its place 4 prominent horns came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the heavenly lights, and some of the lights, that is, some of the stars, it threw down to the earth, and it trampled them. It even exalted itself to be equal with the commander of the army, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And because of an offense, the army was given to the horn, along with the regular sacrifice, and it will hurl truth to the ground and do as it pleases and be successful. So here's this vision that comes upon Daniel. I'm not going to spend too much time. I do have some notes up here that we can summarize. You have a ram with two horns, one longer than the other. The ram's powerful, does whatever it pleases, becomes great. It's a picture of a great empire. The goat attacks the ram. Then a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes appears, moves about the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat attacks the ram, impales it, smashes its two horns, throws it to the ground and tramples it, and no one is able to rescue the ram. The goat makes himself exceedingly great, and once the goat becomes powerful, the large horn is broken, and in its place, 4 horns appear. So what is being described here? Well, Daniel wants to know, and it says in verse 13, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, 'How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the offense causes horror, so as to allow both the sanctuary and the army to be trampled?'" How long is this going to happen? That the people and the sanctuary are being devastated. And it says, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be properly restored. So now we're getting into numbers. You know, when you get into numbers in apocalyptic literature, everybody kind of can go berserk sometimes. But we get into these numbers, and we have to determine what do these numbers mean. If they mean something, we can identify. But we're given an explanation in this book of both the ram and the goat and the little horn. The little horn, as it describes in the second part, it says, "Out of one of them, one of the 4 horns that is, came a small horn which grew exceedingly great towards the south and the east and towards the beautiful land." What do you think the beautiful land might be? Yeah, the land of promise, right? "It grew to the heavenly lights and threw some of them to the earth and trampled them. It exalted itself to be equal to the commander or prince," depending on your translation. It may say prince of the army or prince of the host. "And it removed the regular sacrifice from him," that is, the commander or the prince, "and the place of the sanctuary was overthrown. And because of an offense," it says, "the army and a regular sacrifice will be given to him, and he will hurl truth to the ground and do as he pleases." So that's the thing we're most interested in. What is all of this? And we're told, how long will this last? Well, it'll last 2,300 evenings and mornings, or 2,300 days, we might say, on that. So Gabriel is given an explanation. "When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of the Ulai, and he called and said out to Gabriel, 'Gabriel, explain the vision to this man.'" So in the vision here, if you're picturing this, you have someone who is between the 2 banks. So someone is either walking on the water or suspended in the air, and that one orders Gabriel to explain the vision, the meaning of these things to Daniel. Now, what's interesting, if you were jump ahead, before we look at this vision, when we jump ahead to verse 27, the last verse of the chapter, it says, after he receives the explanation, it says, "Then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick for days. Then I got up and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was no one to explain it." So the question is, when Daniel receives this explanation to help him understand the vision, does he understand it or not? And I think there's 2 ways of looking at that. One is, did he understand the symbols in the vision? Well, yeah, I think the symbols are explained to a significant degree. He understands the symbols of the vision. But does he understand why these things are going to take place? No, I don't think he understands why. And he's disturbed, he's exhausted, he's sickened by it. So I think there's an extent to which Daniel clearly understood the implications of the meaning of this vision that we're going to talk about. but he doesn't really understand why these things are going to happen. So let's talk about that before we get into the explanation. I take the view, as you're going to see here, that what's being described here on the vision of the period of time, and again, this the little horn that is here, is referring to a period of Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, who was the 8th king of the Seleucid Empire. It's referring to the period of indignation, which is placed upon the temple from 171 BC to 165 BC. We'll try to support that claim here in a moment, but it's not terribly disagreed with by hardly anybody that that's what it's taken about, although there are those who disagree. But that's what this period is referring to. And I'm of the opinion that if you notice number 2 on this point where it's explained the little horn, it says he's powerful but not by his own power. What do you think that might mean? The little horn is powerful but not by his own power. Yeah. It's because he is there because God has placed him there. It talks about an offense. And I take the position that the rise of the power of Antiochus Epiphanes, his subjugation of the city of Jerusalem, his persecution of Jerusalem, his knocking to the earth and trampling some of the lights, the stars of the host. That is, he's going to inflict harm on the Jewish people. He's going to kill some of them, many of them, in fact. He's going to trample them and kill them. The book of Maccabees says that in the terror of Antiochus Epiphanes over Jerusalem, that in 2 days he killed 80,000 people. Now, how reliable is 1 Maccabees? Well, it's not inspired works. It's not even included in the Jewish Bible, even though the Jews revered Judas Maccabees. But it's not considered, inspired work, but it's a work of history. We can look at it in the same way we might look at other ancient historians, even though he's clearly written with some bias. But there is a persecution upon the city of Jerusalem, and if you read a little bit into the history of Jerusalem, this is likely a judgment that has come upon the people, upon the city. If we look at the carrying away of Israel, that was a judgment from God. If we look at the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon, that is a judgment upon God. We come to the middle of the 2nd century BC, and what do we find? We find Jerusalem being greatly persecuted. We see the temple being defiled. We see sacrifices taken away. And I want to suggest to you it's likely a judgment from God again. And it's a significant event. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a few minutes. But it's a significant event. You could say in the intertestamental period, that is the period between the Testament, the 400 years of silence that we sometimes refer to, this is the most significant piece of history during that period as it pertains to the Jews. So it's not surprising that it is taken up here in the book of Daniel in his prophecies and his description of events to come. So the little horn, let's look at the description. It says Daniel is trying to understand it. Gabriel is told to give him an explanation. And it says in verse 17, so he came near to where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. So Gabriel comes to Daniel, and Daniel is so afraid that he collapses. And Gabriel says to him, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. So that's the first thing that we have to kind of deal with when we're looking at this. What is the time of the end? That's an important question and leads many people astray in their attempt to understand this passage. The time of the end often is just assumed to be the end of the world, the very end, the end of everything. But that's not what it's talking about here in this passage. In fact, he goes on to say in verse 19, he says, Behold, I'm going to inform you of what will occur at the final period of the indignation because it pertains to the appointed time of the end. So he's talking about the end of a period of time, but it's not the end of all time that he's talking about. In fact, he's specific here, and he says, I'm going to inform you of what will occur at the final period of the indignation. So that's the second thing. What is the period of the indignation that's being described here? So the explanation is, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen at the end, and specifically at the end of the period of indignation. So what is the period of indignation? So he goes on with the explanation. In verse 20 he says, the ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia, which means they now, can't remember what order I have these slides, which means they now correspond with the bear of chapter 7, which is identified as Medo-Persia or Media and Persia. So the ram corresponds to the bear, which we've already said corresponds to the silver of chapter 2, right? So we've identified where on the time frame we are by this definition given to the ram as representing Media and Persia. So in chapter 8 we come to the ram. It represents the bear. It represents the silver of chapter 7 and chapter 2. Now we're on our timeline. We know what period of time we're looking at. It says the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. Is that specific enough for us? It's Greece. So the goat of chapter 8 is Greece, which was identified with the leopard of chapter 7, which was identified with the bronze of chapter 2. So on our timeline, we know of the four empires that we've discussed, that we're looking at Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. We're now in this book, or in this chapter, talking about the silver and bronze, or the bear and the leopard, the ram and the goat, all corresponding to the same thing, right? So when you put it on a chart and you start mapping it out, it becomes somewhat simple, doesn't it? To identify what these symbols are referring to. But we come here to chapter 8, we're just told. The ram is Medo-Persia, the goat is the kingdom of Greece, and we're given a little more information. And the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. Now, a little tricky here. We identify this with Alexander the Great. Was Alexander the Great the first king of Greece? He was the first king of united Greece. The significance of Alexander the Great, that he took these city-states that represented the different countries or empires in Greece, and he brought them under control of one overarching nation. And in that sense, he was its first king. And certainly, without any question from anybody, believers and unbelievers alike, if you're going to talk about the first king of the Grecian Empire, it is clearly Alexander, one of the great military leaders of all time, and one of the great conquerors of all time. And if we go back to the earlier descriptions of the goat, it says the goat, which came and destroyed the ram, the goat is moving across the whole earth without touching the ground. And if we went back to the leopard in chapter 7, we had a leopard that had 4 wings, this idea of speed. And one of the things that historians and military people note about Alexander the Great is the amazing speed with which he conquered most of the known world, that he just conquered with such speed. And that's being referred to here. So he is the horn that is between the eyes of the goat. The goat is Greece. The horn is the first king, which is clearly Alexander. It says the broken horn and the 4 horns that came up in his place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from this nation. So it says here, the horn, we're told in the vision that the first king, the great horn, is broken. And it says at the time that he comes to power that he's broken. And if we look at the history of Alexander the Great, he was dead at 32. He conquered most of the world, and legend says he sat and wept because there was nothing else to conquer, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but nearly true. But he becomes sick, and he dies in Babylon of illness. And he had no children. He had no successors. One famous quote, and I wish I'd written it down, but somebody, some historian asked Alexander, who's going to take over for you? Who's going to be in your place? And his reply was simply, the strongest. In other words, they're going to have to fight it out. And what we know from history is that at the death of Alexander, his kingdom ends up being divided among 4 of his generals. So 4 of his generals take over. They each divide up the kingdom and they take apart. It was actually more than that, but when all the civil wars and the infighting all settled, it was divided into 4. The most prominent of those 4 are the first 2 on that list, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The Ptolemies take Egypt, the Seleucids take Syria. And that's going to be significant as we move through the book of Daniel. And much of what we're going to see in the book of Daniel is describing conflicts between these 2 powers. So he says that the first horn is going to be broken, and coming up in its place will be 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. And that is true. None of these ever compare to the reign of Alexander the Great and what he was able to accomplish. He had united Greece. Now Greece is divided again. They'll never be as great as they were under Alexander. And it says, in the latter period of their dominion, when the wrongdoers have run their course, a king will arise. Now, who are the wrongdoers that have to run their course here? We're not given a specific example, but I would suggest to you that one possible answer is this is a reference to the people of God. When the covenant breakers have run their course, when the covenant breakers are back to doing what covenant breakers do, it says then a king will arise. So we have the little horn, which comes from, it says it comes from, a king will arise insolent in his power. Over in verse 9 it says, and out of one of them came a rather small horn. Out of one of who? Well, he's referring to the 4 kings. So out of the Seleucids, Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, arises as part of it and takes over the Seleucid Empire. But it says out of one of them. I want to emphasize that just for a moment. I'm trying in this class not to get off course and talk about the other views of this book. But it's hard not to mention the fact that I spend a lot of time listening to what I think are the incorrect views of Daniel. What do people do with Daniel? How do they come to these conclusions? What is their rationale? Well, in this chapter, you have an explanation given. The ram, Medo-Persia, the goat, Greece, the first king, the great horn is the first king. 4 empires come out of it after he's broken. Everyone pretty much agrees with the explanation of that thing, of those things. You got Medo-Persia, you got Greece, you got Alexander, you have the 4 generals, the division of the empire. Kind of hard to argue with any of that. But when we come to this little horn, many will say, now see the little horn, that hasn't happened yet. The little horn is a coming Antichrist. But the explanation in Daniel is, out of one of them, that is one of the 4, out of one of them came a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, towards the east, and towards the beautiful land. So the book says, out of one of these 4 will come another. And it describes his activities in the same way that it's described all these other activities. So if you let the text explain itself, you will protect yourself from some really fantastical explanations of these passages. The same thing happens in Daniel chapter 9, which we will start at some point next week. When we get to Daniel chapter 9, and you have the 70 weeks that are there, very famous passage, all right? In order to work in future application of this prophecy and start talking about the great tribulation that is to come, and to talk about things like the rapture and all of that, you go through these 70 weeks, but when you get after 69, you have to say, wait, I know it follows 70 follows 69 here in the book, but what we're going to say is, is that there's this indefinite gap of time that occurs between 69 and 70, which is completely foreign to the book of Daniel. But you have to do that in order to find some future application and explanations. And of course, the explanations from there go crazy. All right? But I want to suggest to you that sometimes the most obvious explanation is the best explanation. Right? And so I think what we're presenting here are the obvious explanations that the book is pointing towards as we go through here. So you have the four empires that rise up out after Alexander the Great. And then it even says, in the latter days, or the latter period of their dominion. So look at our timeline. In 334, Alexander the Great defeats Persia. Interesting, one other quick thing. It talks about the wrath that the goat had towards the ram. I mean, clearly, there's anger and wrath on the part of the ram towards the goat. Well, if you were to look at the period of time in this period that you see here in the silver, these years, the Medo-Persians come to power in 539. In that period of the silver time, Persia attacks the city-states of Greece over and over and over. There's like 100 years of war where Persia is trying to defeat the city-states. And they have some successes and more failures. They're never able to just take over the area of Greece. Do you think there was some bitterness when Alexander goes up against Persia? He is avenging hundreds of years of attacks on the part of the Persians. So if we look at our time period, 334 BC, all the way down to the Maccabean period, or the period of Antiochus. Antiochus, I think I've got a date. Yeah, here we go. Antiochus, born in 215 BC, dies in 164 BC, but he was ruling the Seleucids from 175 to 164. If we go back really quick to our chart here, you'll see that in 146, the Romans conquer the Grecian peninsula. So if we say they began in 334, but now we're talking about 175 to 164, on this chart, where are we? We're in the latter period of the dominion of Greece. Greece, 15 years later, is going to be conquered, by, or 15 to 20 years later, is going to be conquered by Rome. So we are, in fact, in the latter period of their dominion that we see here, that this little horn comes up, and it describes the little horn. I'll just give a little bit of history on Antiochus Epiphanes here. He rules from 175 to 164. He wages war with the Ptolemies and any others, but he particularly at least twice invaded Egypt, never completely conquers, doesn't take their capital city, but makes Egypt relatively irrelevant for a long period of time. But he has frustrations in that he can never completely conquer them. He makes 2 visits to Jerusalem, both times returning from battles with Egypt. And Jerusalem was a somewhat rebellious city because Antiochus Epiphanes really tried to force Greek culture, Greek religions on its conquered nations, which the nation of Greece had not, just like the Romans behind them, never really tried to force culture and religion and worship upon its conquered territories. But Antiochus was an exception to that. He was trying to Hellenize all of his lands and was trying to force upon the Jews his pagan religion, which led to lots of rebellion. And Jerusalem had its own problems, its own iniquities, its own rebellion against God during this period as well. And this conflict leads to a period of harshness, which could be defined as from 171 to 165. So a period of about 6 years is this period of harshness where he is really going up against Jerusalem. He takes control of temple worship. He stops the daily sacrifices. He uses the temple for pagan worship towards Zeus. And he even sacrifices a pig on the altar, a very famous incident, which they sacrifice a pig, which if you understand Jewish law, that's just a a total desecration to sacrifice a swine on the altar of God, and notably sprinkled its blood over not only the altar but in the Holy of Holies, and ended the daily sacrifices that were going on. The Maccabean period of rebellion, famous period in the Jewish history in 165 BC, ended this indignation. And in John chapter 10 and verse 22, you see there mentioned Jesus comes to Jerusalem at the period of the Feast of Dedication. That is referring to what we here referred to today as Hanukkah. All right? So, and Hanukkah can be as early as the latter part of November, can go into Jerusalem, but generally we associate Hanukkah with the period in December. And so you see Hanukkah stuff everywhere. At the same time, Christians are focusing on Christmas because that's when that feast was. But it's referred to in John chapter 10 in verse 22. Jesus was in Jerusalem at the period of this feast. And I want to just mention to you, when we look in the Old Testament, there are three primary feasts. There are three primary feasts that the Jews worship because they are put together for us in the Old Testament. The first is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is what? Passover. All right? In Exodus chapter 12 through verse 15 is when Passover comes about, and there becomes a feast that they recognize every year. Number two was the Feast of Weeks, which is also what? I'll give you a hint. It comes 50 days after Passover. Pentecost, right? Pentecost is a reference to the 50 days. It was 7 weeks and 1 day following Passover was the Feast of Weeks. The third was the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, and which is referenced incidentally in Ezra. I think Mark may get to that at some point soon if we ever finish this class. It's mentioned in the book of Zechariah. The book of Ezra is used figuratively in Zechariah. It's instituted in Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy chapter 16. And it was a celebration of the period of where the Israelites in their journey in the Exodus dwelt in tents. It's the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And of course, we can look, I think, in John 9, maybe off a chapter there. We see Jesus in Jerusalem for this feast. And I've talked before in talking about that, the Festival of Lights that was associated with Feast of Booths, where Jesus makes his claim, I am the light of the world. Well, at the time of Jesus, these three had one added, which wasn't in the law, but one which they recognized, and that was the Feast of Dedication. And the Feast of Dedication was a celebration of the Maccabean revolt and the rededication of the temple, the cleansing of the temple from the indignations and desecrations which had been brought about by Antiochus. So you can see how significant these events were. That in the time of Jesus, there was a fourth feast added to the calendar of the Jews in which they memorialized this period of rededication, this period of cleansing of the temple, where the Jews threw off the oppression of Antiochus Epiphanes. One other thing that I want to mention here, it says, he will destroy the mighty men of the people, verse 24. Through his shrewdness, he will make deceit a success by his influence. He will make himself great in his own mind. And it says, he will even oppose the prince of princes. The phrase Epiphanes is a moniker that Antiochus IV ascribed to himself. And its meaning in Greek is God manifest. Because Antiochus came to claim that he was Zeus in the flesh. And that fits this description here. Antiochus Epiphanes exalted himself to be equal with God, to be a God himself in his own time, and that is described. So what is the 2300? Let's do that before we leave. What is the 2300? How long is this going to last? 2300 days. And I want to suggest to you that when we look at the numbers in the book of Daniel, they are approximations. They're not meant to be to the day, but they're approximations. I think that that's even true of the 70 years of captivity. Start trying to work out when the 70 years began and end, and you're going to give yourself a headache. But it is a symbolic number, which was approximately true. The 70 weeks, 490 years, a symbolic number, which is approximately true. The periods of 3.5, symbolic numbers, which are approximately true. And the 2,300 days, and it's an approximation of the 6 years, Antiochus Epiphanes, if you work out the math, divide 2,300 by 360, you're going to come up with something close to 6 years. And that is the period. How long would this indignation last? The time with which Antiochus Epiphanes was persecuting and enforcing Hellenization upon the nation of Israel. So he says in conclusion, but as for you, keep the vision secret, because it pertains to many days in the future. And I think this is simply a way of him saying to Daniel, Daniel, don't worry. There's a time before this is going to happen. In fact, it's quite a while before